And so I have a map coming up here in a moment. I guess we'll bring that up now. Coming out of the Battle of Jericho, and here's Ai, and here's the little town Bethel. We're going to read about this event right here. I guess I'll read chapter 8 here for us. Just throughout the Old Testament, prior to the book of Joshua, God's constantly said, especially in Exodus and Deuteronomy, about, I'm going to be with you, and I'm going to lead you, and I'm going to be the one taking these people out. You basically need to follow me and whatnot. And just one verse that I came across to remind us, in Exodus 23:30, it says, I will drive them out, talking about the Canaanites, before you, little by little, until you become fruitful and take possession of the land. Okay, chapter 8. Now the Lord said to Joshua, do not fear or be dismayed. Take all the people of war with you and arise, go up to Ai. See, I have given into your hand the king of Ai, his people, his city, and his land. You shall do to Ai and its king just as you did to Jericho and its king. You shall take only its spoil and its cattle as plunder for yourselves. Set an ambush for the city behind it. So Joshua rose with all the people of war to go up to Ai, and Joshua chose 30,000 men, valiant warriors, and sent them out at night. He commanded them, saying, see, you are going to ambush the city from behind. Do not go very far from the city, but all of you be ready. Then I and all the people who are with me will approach the city, and it will come about, when they come out to meet us at first, that they will flee, that we will flee before them. They will come out after us until we have drawn them away from the city. For they will say they are fleeing before us as at the first. So we will flee before them. And you shall rise from your ambush and take possession of the city, for the Lord your God will deliver it into your hand. Then it will be when you have seized the city that you shall set the city on fire. You shall do to it according to the word of the Lord. See, I have commanded you. So Joshua sent them away. They went to the place of ambush and remained there in Bethel, between Bethel and Ai, on the west side of Ai. But Joshua spent the night among the people. Now Joshua rose early in the morning and mustered the people, and he went up with the elders of Israel before Ai, the people of Ai. Then all the people of war who were with him went up and drew near and arrived in front of the city and camped on the north side of Ai. Now there was a valley between him and Ai, and he took about 5,000 men and set them in ambush between Bethel and Ai on the west side of the city. So they stationed the people, all the army that was on the north side of the city, and its rear guard on the west side of the city, and Joshua spent the night in the midst of the valley. It came about, when the king of Ai saw it, that the men of the city hurried and rose up early and went out to meet Israel in battle, he and all his people, at the appointed place before the desert plain. But he did not know that there was an ambush against him behind the city. Joshua and all Israel pretended to be beaten before them and fled by the way of the wilderness. And all the people who were in the city were called together to pursue them, and they pursued Joshua and were drawn away from the city. So not a man was left in Ai or Bethel who had not gone out after Israel, and they left the city unguarded and pursued Israel. Then the Lord said to Joshua, stretch out the javelin that is in your hand toward Ai, for I will give it into your hand. So Joshua stretched out the javelin that was in his hand toward the city. The men in ambush rose quickly from their place, and when he had stretched out his hand, they ran and entered the city and captured it, and they quickly set the city on fire. When the men of Ai turned back and looked, behold, the smoke of the city ascended to the sky, and they had no place to flee this way or that, for the people who had been fleeing to the wilderness turned against the pursuers. When Joshua and all Israel saw that the men in ambush had captured the city, and that the smoke of the city ascended, they turned back and slew the men of Ai. The others came out of the city to encounter them, so that they were trapped in the midst of Israel, some on this side and some on that side, and they slew them until no one was left of those who survived or escaped. But they took alive the king of Ai and brought him to Joshua. Now it came about, when Israel had finished killing all the inhabitants of Ai in the field and the wilderness where they pursued them, and all of them were fallen by the edge of the sword until they were destroyed, then all Israel returned to Ai and struck it with the edge of the sword. All who fell that day were both men and women, were 12,000, all the people of Ai. For Joshua did not withdraw his hand from which he stretched out the javelin until he had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai. Israel took only the cattle and the spoil of the city as plunder for themselves, according to the word of the Lord, which he had commanded Joshua. So Joshua burned Ai and made it a heap forever, a desolation until this day. He hanged the king of Ai on a tree until evening, and at sunset Joshua commanded and took his body down from the tree and threw it at the entrance of the city gate and raised over it a great heap of stones that stands to this day. Then Joshua built an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, in Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the sons of Israel, as is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones in which no man had wielded an iron tool, and they offered burnt offerings on it to the Lord and sacrificed peace offerings. He wrote there on the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he had written in the presence of the sons of Israel. All Israel with their elders and officers and their judges were standing on both sides of the ark before the Levitical priest who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, the stranger as well as the native. Half of them stood in front of Mount Gerizim, and the other half of them in front of Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had given command at first to bless the people of Israel. Then afterwards he read all the words of the law, the blessing and the curse, according to all that was written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded which Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel, with the women and little ones and the strangers who were living among them. So, as you can see, if I understand this right, they came up, and here's Ai, here's Bethel. This looks like the line where Joshua went into the north side of the city and camped out here in the valley. And then the 30,000 men came around to the backside of the city for the ambush. I don't know where the 5,000 men fit in. Maybe somebody else figured this out. But it says the 5,000 were between Bethel and Ai on the west side, I thought it said. So there's another 5,000 out there working the ambush too, sounds like. So I don't know. And also, it's interesting, I think it said the people of Bethel came over to help fight Israel here. So I don't know if besides the 30,000 we know was to help ambush the city. The other 5,000, I don't know if that was to protect them from Bethel or what. But, there were some specific instructions by God what to do, even down to picking up a javelin. And they did that. Joshua followed through on that. So keeping what we just read in mind, compared to what, if you remember last week, what happened in Ai, do you remember the difference? Some things that might have happened differently? Why it failed besides Achan, and this time, why it went so well. You remember last time, they never inquired of God. Joshua sent out the 2 spies. They went up there and said, oh, this is easy. It's a piece of cake, basically. We'll just send 2,000 or 3,000 men. We can take Ai. Well, that didn't work out. They didn't inquire of God. They were, see, this time God sent all the people of Israel up to fight Ai. And so there's just the comparison of this time they're following the words of God and how to attack Ai. Do you see any other observations in chapter 8? We just read some points of interest. Yes, I'm sorry.
At the start, it kind of breaks into some different pieces here. I tried to mark it out, but like in the very first part of 8, do not fear, do not be dismayed, take all the fighting men with you, and I have given into your hand the king. And then it looks like he says that a little bit later on too. But one thing that I think is neat about what happened at Jericho, which was a significant battle, a bigger city with real forces and wall versus a little easy win in Ai, is with God you can overcome the biggest obstacles at Jericho. But if you don't have God, you can't even overcome the little stuff at Ai. And so you see twice in chapter 8 this idea of, I have given this into your hand. I'm the way that you're going to win this whole stuff, not without me. Big or small.
Yes, we definitely see a difference here when the second go-around compared to the first go-around. God is clearly involved in this battle this time. You brought up the very first part of chapter 8. I mean, chapter 7, remember, God was pretty upset with Israel in the whole story about Achan. But Joshua and Israel dealt with that. And you start off right off the bat on 8. God's forgot about it. That's behind us. He doesn't bring it up anywhere. That failure has been overcome because they dealt with it and they listened to God. And now God is there giving them directions, which should be a lesson for us that, we may stumble and fall at times, but there's no reason why we can't ever be picked up by God when we listen to him and do what he says. You mentioned about Ai being a small town. What was unique, if you remember, I think it was mentioned in here, how did God use to his advantage to help Joshua and Israel get them to win this battle? What was in the minds of the people of Ai?
The fact that they were successful the first time to trick them into thinking they were successful again.
Yeah. The wisdom of God here again. They were overly confident. We whipped them last time, and they ran with their tail between their legs. This is a piece of cake. Let's go out and get them. So we see the wisdom of God use that arrogance and that overconfidence against them because they completely, left themselves unguarded, the city. What other things do you see in this chapter compared to last, in particular about Achan? Yes, in the back.
One of the things that I saw is that Achan took from God's plundering. That was to be, everything was devoted to God. Everything's devoted to destruction or was valuable in the sense that God was going to use it for his purposes. And they were to plunder Jericho that way. But here at Ai, they were given a plundering for themselves. That was interesting.
If Achan just would have waited, he was going to get his chance, but he didn't wait. God was giving the people the opportunity to take the plunder, etc. What about patience here? I know these are difficult battles to read about and how they turned out and whatnot. But there should be a lesson here about the limit of God's patience We know centuries earlier that God mentioned about the iniquity of the Amorites, which are these people we're talking about, hadn't been fulfilled yet. But now it has, apparently, because the judgment against them has come. If you read in Deuteronomy 18, and if you look at Numbers 27, you'll see, like in Numbers, there's a list of things that God tells the Israelites when you come in this land that you shouldn't do. And there's a list of sexual sins that, I don't know what generation, well, I will say there was a generation here, but the things of incest and sex with animals, all the gross things you think about and read about, I've heard about, there's a list of them. He says that these are the things that these people are doing that he does not want you to do, which, okay. There was sorcery, witchcraft, spirit division, and all this sort of thing, not to mention the false gods and whatnot. Child sacrifice, I think Moloch was the god they used for sacrificing children to. Things that are just hard to comprehend that was part of this judgment on them and reason for judgment on them. What about toward the end of the chapter? This is from verse 30 to 35. This is kind of a unique situation. So Joshua has a job to do, Israel, to conquer this land. They call this kind of the central campaign. I don't know if I have. There's a central/southern campaign, which is kind of where we are. The central, and then they're going to attack this in the next chapter 10. And then after that, they go up to the north. Lost a train of thought here. Oh. They leave here. Instead of dealing with this, which they'll come up to next chapter, they go north to these two mountains. If you go, it's in Deuteronomy, I forgot where I wrote it down here, 11, in Deuteronomy 27, Moses commanded them and told them, when you get into this land, that you should go up to these two mountains. And that was, as we remember, one was the blessing and one was the curse. There's a list, the law of Moses, and a list of the blessings. If you do these things, God will be with you. And if you list of curses, if you do these things, God is not going to be with you. He's going to turn his back on you. And it was commanded to go up there about the stones. Don't put any steel to them. They should be uncut stones. Write them down on the stones. Stand on the mountains. Actually, it says 6 tribes are supposed to stand on one mountain here, and the other 6 stand on this mountain here. And it turns out this Shechem is where this city lies, right in the valley there. I think Ryan found this picture of it. There is Ebal and Gershenson, and there's the city of Shechem there. And that the Levite priests would be in the center in the valley with the ark, and they would read all the blessings and the curses, and the people on this side would say amen at the end, and people on that side would say the amen on the curses. So this is a big deal. I don't know what you want to call it, some spiritual pilgrimage or something, or what, but they made a point to stop the fighting and the battle and go up here and do exactly what they were told to do by Moses, who was told to by God. And when they were up there, they had a burnt offering. They had a peace offering. They made these offerings on an altar with these uncut stones. They wrote the law down on the stones. They read the law. I think I read that this is kind of a natural amphitheater where the sound, people can hear each other in this valley. So you can see, I mean, the sacrifice of the burnt offerings typically were meant for atonement for sins. And the peace offerings were a thanksgiving and a fellowship offering. All of these things are like completely opposite of what the people in Canaan had been practicing and how and who they were worshiping and how they were worshiping and so forth. You see any other comments or have any other thoughts on what we read here? Yes.
Can you go back to the map? Go back one. From Ai to Shechem's 20 miles.
20-mile hike. Yeah.
It's 20 miles, and it's interesting, if you look at verse 29, we're fighting and we're finishing up the battle of Ai, and then the very next verse, we've gone 20 miles north and we're doing something that doesn't have anything to do with fighting and taking the land. And it seems like this is a huge reminder to us in the book of Joshua where this sits, that we have this balance between conquest and covenant, these two things. And it's almost like God is saying, you guys going out and fighting and taking this land, that's only a very small part of what this is about. This is about you being in a relationship with me and everybody. The word all is used in this text, like in verse 34. You see 34 and 35, there's 4 different times, all, do everything. It seems unnatural for us because we're like, we gotta go, we gotta do, we gotta make these things happen. And what God is showing us and saying in this is, no, you have to obey me and be right with me. And if you're right with me, I'll take care of all the other stuff. I think it's a nice reminder for the way that we prioritize our lives and think about our stuff.
Well, it seems like it's a huge commitment, a reminder of their commitment to God and their relationship, basically what you're saying. That would, if you picture this in your mind, it'd be pretty impressive. The whole nation there with the 2 mountains and reading the law and the ark, the God's in between them, basically. And their dedication, and they're agreeing to this, and they're committing to this. You see the similarities why we come together twice a week. We come together on a Sunday morning. The need to be encouraged and to be reminded, and our commitment, God's plan, the need for the church, kind of fits in there with this idea of the need to be committed and to reminded. This is just as we share in the Lord's Supper every week. It's a reminder, and we need that reminder. It's a reminder of our covenant made with Him and what He's done for us, just like what they were doing here. Anything else you see? I think it's a reminder how important it is to obey God and how foolish it was to not obey God. Okay, chapter 9. Let me see how this works. If I got time. So, if you can see this thing right here. This is a tree. This is a home of a spider called a purse web spider. I've never heard of a purse web spider. And he lives in there almost his entire life. And here is a picture of him right here. Big old fangs. This is your typical spider, pinchers, and he's got the big old tarantula-like fangs because he's in that tarantula group. As I was telling Ben about a week ago, Missouri has tarantulas, down south anyway. And so he's got these big old fangs that stab. And he lives in this tube. It's hollow. It's attached at the top right here. It's loose on the bottom or through the rest of it. And what the amazing thing is, an insect walks across it like this. He feels the vibration of the insect. The insect has no idea. Because also, this spider comes out and he puts mud or dirt, and he puts moss, and he puts lichen, whatever it is. make it look like a twig or a branch or something. So he's camouflaged his web, basically, his house. And so the insects are unsuspecting. They walk across it like this. And here's the sick thing that happens. I don't like spiders. So he sits in here inside his home and he feels the vibration of the bug. He stabs the bug through his home, through the nest. And then he takes one of his fangs, holds the bug, and takes the other one. He cuts a slit on the side of his tube house, and then he pulls the bug inside, sews up the slit, and enjoys his dinner. And then the hard parts, you know how spiders are, they eat the insides. The hard parts get thrown out the door up on top. And some of the pieces fall on the bottom. So anyway, I saw this. This is out of my Missouri Conservation Magazine. I wish I would have brought that. It's free. I've been getting it for 40, 50 years, since I was in my 20s, I think. You just order it. I encourage you, if you like outdoor stuff and you got kids, it's got all kinds of stuff in it. Once a month, you get a free magazine. It's really top quality. And that's where this came from, about a month or so ago. And I thought about this, thinking about deception, because that's what chapter 9 is going to be about, deception. The Gibeonites, or the Percival spider Gibeonites. What do we got here? Okay, we're back. So let's read chapter 9. Could I get somebody to read chapter 9? Go ahead.
As soon as all the kings who were beyond the Jordan, in the hill country and in the lowland, all along the coast of the great sea toward Lebanon, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, heard of this, they gathered together as one to fight against Joshua and Israel. But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai, they on their part acted with cunning and went and made ready provisions, and took worn-out sacks for their donkeys, and wineskins, worn out and torn and mended, with worn-out patched sandals on their feet, and worn-out clothes, and all their provisions were dry and crumbled. And they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal, and said to him and the men of Israel, We have come from a distant country, so now make a covenant with us. But the men of Israel said to the Hivites, Perhaps you live among us, then how would we make a covenant with you? Then how can we make a covenant with you? They said to Joshua, We are your servants. And Joshua said to them, Who are you? And where do you come from? They said to him, From a very distant country your servants have come, because of the name of the Lord your God. We have heard a report of him, and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites, who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon the king of Heshbon, and to Og king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth. So our elders and all the inhabitants of our country said to us, Take provisions in your hand for the journey, and go to meet them, and say to them, We are your servants. Come now, make a covenant with us. Here's our bread. It was still warm when we took it from our houses as our food, for the journey on the day we set out to come to you. But now, behold, it's dry and crumbly. These wineskins were new when we filled them, and behold, they burst. And these garments and sandals of ours are worn out from the very long journey. So the men took some of their provisions, but did not ask counsel from the Lord. And Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them, to let them live, and the leaders of the congregation swore to them. At the end of 3 days after they had made a covenant with them, they heard that they were their neighbors, and that they lived among them. And the people of Israel set out and reached their cities on the 3rd day. Now their cities were Gibeon, Chephirah, Beeroth, and Kiriath-Jearim. But the people of Israel did not attack them, because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and now we may not touch them. This we will do to them. Let them live, lest wrath be upon us, because of the oath that we swore to them. And the leaders said to them, let them live. So they became cutters of wood and drawers of water for all the congregation, just as the leaders had said. Joshua summoned them, and he said to them, why did you deceive us, saying, we are very far from you, when you dwell among us? Now therefore you are cursed, and some of you shall never be anything but servants, cutters of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God. They answered Joshua, because it was told to your servants for a certainty that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land from before you. So we feared greatly for our lives because of you and did this thing. And now, behold, we are in your hand. Whatever seems good and right in your sight to do to us, do it. So he did this to them and delivered them out of the hand of the people of Israel. And they did not kill them. But Joshua made them that day cutters of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord to this day in the place that he should choose.
All right, thank you. So, we got a few minutes here. How did they pull this off? How did the Gibeonites? Looks like the other kings were forming an alliance, we see. They're all going to join up. Gibeonites just realized we're not going to win. We got to come up with a different way of surviving. Their method, how was Joshua and the elders tricked here? How did they get fooled?
Verse 14 said that they did not ask counsel of the Lord.
Yeah. Hope you know the story how they pulled the purse web deal, put a bunch of camel stuff on her bodies and old bread. Probably sounded pretty convincing. And that most of us would have probably fallen for it. But the key is Joshua and the elders didn't ask for counsel from the Lord. James 4:2, part of the end of it says, you do not have because you do not ask. It's a reminder for us to know and to ask and to find out God's will. Deception. Who likes to be deceived? I don't know if that's ever happened to you about something. Makes you pretty angry when somebody pulls that on you. You think Joshua made this covenant with the Gibeonites, but they deceived him. You think, well, since you did that to me, I'm not going to keep the covenant. That kind of just nixes everything. But how did Joshua deal with that? He's got the people all upset with him. He's in a tough spot there. What's he do? Because he made peace with the Gibeonites. Now they all find out that they're next door neighbors. What's Joshua do? I'm sorry? Yeah. So they thought they might have gotten away with it, but they turned out to be basically slaves to the Israelites, but they were still alive. Joshua honored the covenant. I can't remember, we've run across this somewhere before, but it just stuck with me because it comes across in this culture that people, when they made a covenant, they made a covenant. There was a contract. They kept their word. And Joshua, it seems like he had every reason to break that covenant because of the way he was deceived, but he didn't. You see the integrity of Joshua. the Gibeonites wind up living amongst the Israelites. And although maybe it's a curse, because now they're the slaves, but I think from my short reading on the Gibeonites, they lived at peace with the Israelites. They weren't their enemies. They actually were exposed to Jehovah with this arrangement now. I believe, somebody can correct me, that I think when Saul was king, for some reason he took vengeance against the Gibeonites, tried to wipe them out. And when David became king, I forget where this is at, 2 Samuel, there was a 3-year drought, and David went to God, why, what's happening? And God said it's because of the blood that Saul and his family shed against the Gibeonites. And so David went to the Gibeonites and said, how can we make this right? And the Gibeonites said, give us 7 sons of Saul to kill, basically, and David did that and avenged the harm that Saul did to the Gibeonites. So it says something about the Gibeonites living with the Israelites and so forth that came out of this arrangement here. And your thoughts on what we read so far? Yes, Dave.
I don't know, I've got a question, I guess. Is there any correlation between the covenant that was made with Rahab? Because that was, the spies covenanted, swore to God that they would covenant with her to save her, so long as they both kept the covenant. And then here, Joshua and the elders of Israel also covenanted with that same swearing by the Lord, or at least for the Gibeonites. I thought it was interesting how there's covenant relationship is being revealed with people who are not of God's people.
Yeah.
And how they're ending up among Israel in these different ways.
Exactly. Yeah, we don't have, I don't know any more than what you said, but it's interesting. You could look at the comparison of Rahab, lied, deceitfulness, whatever, compared to the Gibeonites. There's some similarities, but Rahab's listed in Hebrews because of her faith. Rahab was put on the spot quickly. These people had plenty of time to devise a plan. Rahab, if you look at her confession about God's people, it's a lot more built on faith versus the Gibeonites, etc. There's some fairly differences between the two, but some similarities. But both of them wind up living with God's people, as you said. So as we close here, lessons learned about deceitfulness. Some familiar passages we know about. Let's read 2 Corinthians. Talks about Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Ephesians 6:11 said, put on the full armor of God so that you will be able to stand firm the schemes of the devil. In practice, you run across people who are nice and warm and friendly, and it's hard to deal with, when the truth gets distorted or deception. It's hard to pick up. It's just not as easy, black and white sometimes in real life, dealing with deception. Especially when you read in 1 Corinthians 13 about how we are to love, the attributes of love, to be patient, to bear all things, hope all things in people. And Christians were trained to, I don't want to say drop our guard down, but to be trusting and whatnot. And so I think Satan can take advantage of that at times if we're not aware of that. Whatnot. But it goes back to the lesson here was to inquire of God and to know God. Back to the importance of seeking God's guidance. James 1:5, but if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. Any other thoughts? We got 1 or 2 minutes here. Any spider stories, or I guess I should have taken that off. Of course, the spider comes out of his nest, he gets eaten, so he needs that camouflage to protect himself, but then he also uses it to survive by eating other bugs. So it's amazing how God's designing nature and lessons we can learn from it. Yes, Dave.
One thought, this passage reminds me that when people lie to you, you're still accountable for that, for believing that lie. I thought that was, I mean, at least in this scenario. Does that make sense?
Yes. Well, the lesson is they didn't go back to God and ask, and going back to God and ask means we need to understand His will, which we have much of here in His Word. So, all right, thank you. Appreciate the class. Kids are coming.